In the turbulent, blood-drenched epoch of the Roman Empire, where power was forged in the fires of intrigue, betrayal, and ruthless ambition, the imperial throne would pass to Marcus Opellius Macrinus, a man born far from the gilded halls of Rome's Senate. In the distant provinces of Mauretania Caesariensis, modern-day Algeria, Macrinus would rise from obscurity to wield the power of an emperor. His story is not one of noble birth or divine right, but of cunning, fortitude, and the audacity to challenge the ancient structures that governed Rome's ruling class. Macrinus was the first Roman emperor to come from outside the senatorial aristocracy, a man forged not in the elite traditions of Rome's noble families, but in the pragmatic and brutal world of the military and bureaucracy. His path to power was not one of inheritance, but of meticulous maneuvering, where every step was carved in the shadows. This is his story. Macrinus, born in the year 165 AD in present-day Algeria, has been the subject of much speculation regarding his origins. Many distinct tales exist regarding Macrinus, each painting a different picture of the man who would one day wear the imperial crown. One story tells of a youth born into humble circumstances, who made his early living through a variety of rough and laborious means. As a young man, he is said to have been a poacher, and even fought as a gladiator, facing death in the blood-soaked arenas of Rome's imperial games. In this version of his life, Macrinus is portrayed as a man of the people, a survivor who clawed his way up from obscurity through sheer grit and determination. The other more plausible account suggests a different origin, that Macrinus came from an equestrian family, members of Rome's second-tier elite who held substantial wealth but lacked the prestigious lineage of the senatorial class. This narrative also paints him as a student of law, a man whose early career was defined not by brute force, but by intellect and legal acumen. This story seems more likely, as it aligns with the trajectory of his later life and career. Whatever the truth of his early years, it is certain that Macrinus eventually moved to Rome, where his legal expertise earned him a growing reputation. He became known for his sharp mind and meticulous understanding of Roman law, and his skills soon brought him into the inner circles of power. So formidable did his reputation become that he was appointed as the legal advisor to none other than Plautianus, the powerful Praetorian prefect, a position of immense influence. The Praetorian prefect was the man who commanded the Praetorian Guard, hand-picked veterans of the Roman army who served as bodyguards to the emperor. Thus, the education and intellectual prowess of Macrinus allowed him to ascend to the Roman political class. Under the reign of Emperor Septimus Severus, Macrinus's influence began to grow steadily. Severus, a man of formidable military and political acumen, brought stability to the Roman Empire after a period of chaos and uncertainty. His reign was marked by significant military victories, economic recovery, and territorial expansion. He secured the empire's borders and replenished the state's coffers, ensuring that Rome regained much of its former glory. At the same time, he expanded Roman control in the east, solidifying Roman influence in the region. His military campaigns in North Africa and Scotland brought new provinces under Roman control, most notably the defeat of the Garamantians, ancient peoples who may have descended from Berber tribes in North Africa. In the year 208, Severus embarked on a northern campaign in Britain, reinforcing Hadrian's Wall and fortifying the Roman presence in the province. His efforts not only stabilised the frontier, but also ensured Roman dominance in the British Isles for years to come. By the time of his death in the year 211, Severus had restored order to the empire and left it in a stronger position than when he assumed the throne. His passing, however, marked the beginning of a turbulent period for Rome. Upon Severus's death, his two sons Caracalla and Geta were made co-emperors, inheriting the empire as joint rulers. The brothers were tasked with continuing their father's legacy. However, as they journeyed back to Rome from Britannia with their father's ashes, tensions between the siblings began to fester. Caracalla and Geta, whose personalities clashed, soon found themselves locked in a bitter rivalry, each suspicious of the other's intentions. The relationship between the two brothers grew increasingly hostile, with both contemplating a division of the empire. They proposed to split the Roman world along the Bosphorus, with Caracalla ruling the western half and Geta the eastern half. However, their mother, Julia Domna, opposed this idea and worked tirelessly to prevent it. Ancient sources depict Caracalla as a ruthless and tyrannical figure, while Geta is portrayed as a more temperate and mild-mannered man. Their joint reign was a disastrous failure, plagued by constant discord. The imperial palace itself became a symbol of their rivalry, with the brothers living in separate wings, unwilling to even share their servants. Their meetings were rare, and when they did occur, they were always held in the presence of their mother, surrounded by an imposing military guard. Their mutual distrust was so great that they both feared for their lives, each brother suspecting the other of plotting an assassination attempt. The stability of their rule relied entirely on the influence of Julia Domna, the matriarch of the family, and a few loyal senior generals and courtiers. However, Caracalla would soon take drastic action. He arranged a meeting between himself and Geta. The meeting took place in the apartments of their mother, Julia Domna, where under the guise of peace, Caracalla had his brother murdered. Geta was killed in their mother's arms. The brutal murder would set the tone for Caracalla's reign, a period marked by cruelty and bloodshed. Macrinus, a man who had risen through the ranks of Roman society, had earned the trust of the emperor, ultimately securing the position of Praetorian prefect. This promotion elevated him to one of the highest echelons of Roman power, and with it, immense responsibility. As Caracalla's reign progressed, the emperor, increasingly disinterested in the mundane details of governance, delegated more of the administrative tasks to Macrinus. This shift in duties allowed the emperor to focus on the military, which had long been the cornerstone of his political strategy. Caracalla was keenly aware of the loyalty of the legions, and he sought to maintain their support through generous gestures. He instituted substantial pay rises for the average legionary, a move designed to solidify the soldiers' allegiance to him. Alongside these financial incentives, Caracalla endeared himself to the military by spending vast amounts of time among them, developing a rapport with the men who were the backbone of his rule. In his effort to cultivate their loyalty, he adopted their customs, even going so far as to imitate their dress and manners. In addition to his relationship with the soldiers, Caracalla made a highly symbolic move to secure his favour with the wider population of the empire. He proclaimed that all free men within the Roman Empire, regardless of their origins, were to be granted full Roman citizenship. This radical expansion of citizenship was intended to win the hearts and minds of the newly enfranchised, drawing them into a personal allegiance with the emperor, while also bolstering his own political power. In this way, Caracalla sought to create a network of loyal subjects that would support him both as their emperor and as a figure of almost mythical stature. Yet, despite these efforts to cultivate loyalty, Caracalla's erratic behaviour continued to manifest. His admiration for the great figures of the past became even more pronounced, and he increasingly sought to emulate the legendary conquerors who had shaped history. Chief among his inspirations was Alexander the Great, whose personal style and military achievements Caracalla began to mimic openly. In planning his campaign against the Parthian Empire, Caracalla opted to employ the Macedonian phalanx, a military formation that had long been obsolete in Roman tactics, despite the Roman army's sophisticated approach to battle. This decision was not merely a matter of military strategy, but also a reflection of Caracalla's growing obsession with Alexander and his desire to revive the glory of past conquests. In the year 214, Caracalla embarked on a military campaign in the east, marching into Asia Minor via Macedonia with a force of 16,000 men in the traditional Macedonian-style phalanx. He also ordered the construction of numerous statues of Alexander the Great in Rome and across the empire, as though to immortalize himself as a new Alexander. He claimed that King Artabanus of Parthia had denied him the opportunity to marry his daughter, an affront to Caracalla's honour that justified military action. Yet as the war progressed, Artabanus eventually relented, agreeing to the union. This, however, did little to temper Caracalla's aggression. During a celebration to mark the emperor's arrival at the Parthian royal palace, Caracalla ordered a brutal massacre of the assembled guests, a move that shocked even the most hardened soldiers who carried out his command. Herodian, the ancient historian, provides a chilling account of the massacre. A huge mob of barbarians gathered, casually standing about, eager to see the bride and groom, and expecting nothing out of the ordinary. Then the signal was given, and Caracalla ordered his army to attack and massacre the spectators. The Parthians, taken completely by surprise, attempted to flee, but the chaos was overwhelming. With their horses sent out to graze, the Parthian warriors were left vulnerable, and many were slaughtered where they stood. Caracalla's bloodlust, it seemed, had no limits. Among the high-ranking Romans accompanying the emperor on his campaign was Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect who, despite his exalted position, was deeply troubled by the increasingly erratic behaviour of the emperor. Observing the emperor's growing instability, and sensing that Caracalla's violent tendencies could turn against him, Macrinus became increasingly fearful for his own safety. As the emperor's mental state deteriorated, Macrinus concluded that only by eliminating Caracalla could he secure his own survival. He plotted with a soldier named Justin Martialis, who had a personal vendetta against the emperor for refusing to promote him to the rank of centurion. In April of the year 1017, the fateful moment arrived. Caracalla, ever the restless and unpredictable ruler, set out to visit the Temple of Luna. He was accompanied only by Macrinus and his personal bodyguard, a small select group of soldiers. On the 8th of April, as the emperor travelled toward the temple, Macrinus seized the opportunity to execute his plan. At the prearranged moment, the soldier named Justin, acting on the orders of Macrinus, struck Caracalla down with a dagger, plunging it into the emperor's body. The assassination was swift but brutal, as Caracalla was caught off guard while going to the toilet. The assassin was immediately apprehended and killed by the soldiers, his life extinguished before he could reveal any details of the conspiracy or the men behind it. Macrinus, with remarkable swiftness, moved to capitalize on the situation, as Caracalla died without a son and heir. 3 days after the assassination, without waiting for the traditional formalities of Senate confirmation, Macrinus boldly proclaimed himself emperor. He took the imperial titles and powers for himself, presenting a case of calculated opportunism. The legions whose loyalty was paramount in determining imperial rule quickly rallied behind him, offering their support to the new emperor. The Senate, far removed from the events unfolding in the east, were powerless to prevent Macrinus's rise to power. With the military's backing, his position as emperor was unchallenged, and he assumed control of the empire without delay. However, despite his newfound authority, Macrinus never returned to Rome. Instead, he chose to base his rule in Antioch, a strategic and distant location, far from the intrigues and dangers of the capital. From there, he governed the empire, but the choice to remain outside of Rome, while wise in many respects, also marked him as an outsider, someone who had not emerged from the traditional Roman elite. Macrinus was, in fact, the first emperor of the equestrian class, rather than from the traditional senatorial aristocracy. When Macrinus ascended to the imperial throne, the Senate, though initially reluctant to acknowledge the new emperor, found itself in a position where there was no viable alternative. Despite their political reservations, the senators were secretly relieved by his rise, for it marked the end of the reign of the despised Caracalla. Caracalla's actions, from the slaughter of his brother Geta to the brutal murders of anyone he perceived as a threat, had earned him the hatred of the Roman elite. The ascension of Macrinus offered a glimmer of hope for a return to stability. In addition to securing the Senate's reluctant support, Macrinus also won the loyalty of the legions, an essential pillar of power in the Roman Empire. However, Macrinus inherited a host of pressing challenges from his predecessor, many of which threatened the very stability of the empire. Caracalla, known for his aggressive military policies and reckless spending, had left behind a legacy of conflict and financial ruin. The emperor's insatiable thirst for war had led him to engage in unnecessary campaigns and military adventures, straining the empire's resources. His tendency to prefer belligerence over diplomacy had resulted in unresolved conflicts that Macrinus now had to confront. Caracalla had given vast sums of gold to the army in an attempt to secure their loyalty, draining the imperial treasury and leaving Rome on the brink of financial collapse. The funds for these lavish expenditures had been extracted from every corner of the empire, creating a severe shortfall that Macrinus would now have to address. One of the most pressing concerns that Macrinus inherited was the situation in the east, where the Parthian king Artabanus, who had survived Caracalla's bloody massacre of his family, was gathering an enormous army to exact vengeance on Rome. The Parthians had been deeply offended by the Roman breach of a peace treaty, and Artabanus had vowed to avenge the slaughter of his relatives. In a stirring speech to his own troops, Macrinus acknowledged the gravity of the situation, apparently saying, "You see, the barbarian with its whole eastern horde is already upon us. Artabanus has every reason for his enmity. We provoked him by breaking the treaty, and in a time of complete peace, we started war. This is no quarrel over boundaries or riverbeds. Everything is at stake in this dispute. We face a mighty king, fighting for his children and kinsmen, who he believes have been murdered in a violation of solemn oaths." Macrinus, a man with no military experience of his own, understood the precariousness of his position. However, Artabanus would demand financial compensation and the reconstruction of the cities destroyed by the Romans. He also wanted northern Mesopotamia, a region recently seized by Rome under the command of Septimus Severus. For Rome, these terms were simply unacceptable. To cede Mesopotamia would be to lose hard-won territorial gain, and the demands for compensation were beyond what the imperial treasury could afford. Thus, with diplomacy failing and no viable path to peace, Macrinus was forced to prepare for war. The stage was set for the Battle of Nisibis, a brutal and bloody confrontation between the Roman and Parthian forces. The battle, which raged for 3 days, was a costly one for both sides, but in the end the Parthians emerged victorious, though at a staggering cost. The Roman legions, though beaten, had fought valiantly, and the battle's aftermath left both armies severely weakened. In the face of such devastation, Macrinus had little choice but to seek peace. Acknowledging the futility of continuing the war, he agreed to pay the Parthians a substantial sum. The peace settlement, though costly, allowed Macrinus to avert further bloodshed and stabilize the eastern front, at least temporarily. Under Caracalla, the Roman legions had been granted extraordinary bonuses and increased wages, part of an effort to secure their loyalty during his reign. However, these lavish payments had severely depleted the imperial treasury. Macrinus, understanding the delicate balance between fiscal responsibility and military loyalty, faced a difficult dilemma. He could not, without risking open rebellion, reduce the salaries of the soldiers, who had already been promised huge sums. To do so would risk an uprising by the very legions who had put him on the throne. Instead, he crafted a clever solution. He allowed the soldiers already in service to retain their higher wages, but he lowered the pay for new recruits to the level established by Severus. In this way, he sought to prevent further financial strain on the empire. While Macrinus's fiscal reforms were beginning to take shape, the political landscape remained fraught with peril. The greatest threat to his rule was not from outside forces, but from within the very circles of Roman power. Caracalla's mother, the once powerful Julia Domna, had initially been left in peace by Macrinus. Although she had been a central figure during her son's reign, Macrinus hoped to avoid conflict with her, understanding her influence and the loyalty she commanded among the imperial court. However, it was not long before Macrinus learned that Julia was conspiring against him, whether motivated by grief over her son's murder or a desire to preserve the Severan legacy. She had begun to plot Macrinus's downfall. In response to this threat, Macrinus acted swiftly. He had Julia Domna placed under house arrest in Antioch, effectively neutralizing her ability to challenge his authority. By this time, the aging empress was in the final stages of a long and painful battle with some sort of breast cancer, which had taken a heavy toll on her health. Stricken with both physical illness and emotional grief, she soon died in Antioch, her death compounded by her refusal to eat, a tragic end to a woman who had once wielded immense power. Following Julia Domna's death, Macrinus sought to further solidify his grip on power by sending her sister, Julia Maessa, along with Maessa's children, back to their homeland in Emesa, a city in Syria. But Macrinus had underestimated the ambitions of the Severan family. Julia Maessa, ever the astute and ambitious matriarch, was not content to quietly retreat into obscurity. From Emesa, which was conveniently located near a major military base with many soldiers still loyal to the Severan name, Maessa began to plot her family's return to power. She knew that the loyalty of the legions to the Severan dynasty ran deep, especially in the eastern provinces, where Caracalla had been popular among the troops. Emesa, with its proximity to the military base, became the perfect staging point for a coup. Maessa skillfully exploited the discontent among the soldiers, who still revered the Severan family and sought to restore the dynasty to its former glory. As her plans took shape, it became clear that Macrinus was in a perilous position. In the shadow of Macrinus's faltering rule, Julia Maessa carefully laid the groundwork for her next move, a bold challenge to his legitimacy. Realizing that the key to reclaiming the throne for her family lay in the army's loyalty, Maessa began to turn the tide by selecting a new candidate, one with direct ties to the Severan dynasty, a figure who could rally the soldiers and challenge the usurper. Her choice was her grandson, Bassianus, a 14-year-old boy who, though still young, had already garnered attention as the chief priest of the sun god Elagabalus, a revered deity. His role as the high priest in the city of Emesa had allowed him to cultivate a following among the soldiers of the 3rd Legion of the Gallica, who often visited the temple to witness the extravagant and, to them, rather amusing religious ceremonies presided over by the boy. These ritualistic displays, partially theatrical, partially sacred, further elevated Bassianus in the eyes of the soldiers, making him a figure of curiosity and admiration. Seizing on this popularity, Maessa set her plan in motion. To undermine Macrinus's legitimacy, she began spreading rumours that Bassianus was in fact the bastard son of the late Caracalla. She claimed that Caracalla had slept with both of her daughters, one of whom was Bassianus's mother, and that the young priest was the product of this illicit union. This assertion was not just a desperate attempt to tie her grandson to the severed bloodline of the Severan dynasty, but a calculated move to give Bassianus a claim to the throne. His striking resemblance to Caracalla further fueled this narrative. To gain the soldiers' favour, Maessa began offering vast amounts of her own wealth, promising the legions of Emesa generous rewards in exchange for their loyalty. Her financial backing, combined with the promise of restoring the Severan dynasty, proved irresistible. Word of her plans spread like wildfire through the camps of the Roman army. With military loyalty at the heart of her strategy, Maessa arranged for Bassianus, his mother, and herself to be taken under the cover of night to the military camp, where the young boy was immediately declared emperor by the soldiers. Clad in imperial purple, Bassianus was hailed as the rightful ruler. With the backing of the 3rd Legion of Gallica, a formidable force, Maessa's rebellion gained traction. Soldiers from other camps defected from Macrinus to join the newly declared emperor. As a result, Macrinus found himself increasingly isolated, struggling to maintain control over the military. The forces of Macrinus and those of Bassianus would soon meet, and despite Macrinus's determination to quell the uprising, his own legionaries once loyal to him betrayed him, defecting to his enemy's cause. The defection was complete and overwhelming. With his forces shattered, Macrinus was left with little choice but to retreat to Antioch, hoping to regroup and perhaps gain reinforcements. Meanwhile, Bassianus, now emboldened by the support of a full legion, wasted no time. He took the offensive, marching on Antioch with his rapidly growing army. The conflict was now no longer just a matter of political maneuvering. It had become an open military confrontation, with the fate of an empire hanging in the balance. By the early 3rd century, the balance of power in Rome had shifted from the Senate to the military. The emperor's authority no longer rested on senatorial approval or the authority of the Roman elites, but rather on the backing of the legions. The Senate had largely become a ceremonial body, its power waning as the military increasingly held the reins of imperial power. Both Macrinus and Bassianus understood that securing the loyalty of the army was paramount. As the Senate's influence diminished, both rulers found themselves disregarding its counsel and relying instead on military support. Yet in his dire circumstances, Macrinus had no choice but to turn to the Senate for assistance. He hoped that by appealing to the traditional body of Roman power, he might find the resources and legitimacy to push back against the rising tide of rebellion. While in Antioch, Macrinus made one last desperate attempt to rally support from Rome, but his efforts were thwarted by a combination of factors: a lack of funds, distrust from the Senate, and the impending arrival of Bassianus's legions. The Senate, which had once wielded considerable influence, was now unable to send timely reinforcements. Thus, Macrinus was left with only his Praetorian Guard, and he prepared for a final showdown. The final confrontation between the forces of Macrinus and the rebel legions loyal to Bassianus unfolded in the ancient city of Antioch, deep within Roman Syria. The battle would prove to be a decisive moment in the struggle for the throne of the Roman Empire. Macrinus, aware that he faced a determined enemy, made a decision to enhance the mobility of his elite Praetorian Guard. Prior to the engagement, he ordered his soldiers to abandon their traditional heavy-scale armour and grooved shields in favour of lighter oval shields. This adjustment, though designed to improve agility, was a calculated attempt to negate the advance of Bassianus's light infantry. At first, the Praetorians succeeded in their assault, cutting through the ranks of Bassianus's forces with devastating precision. It seems as though victory was within reach. However, the tide of battle would soon shift. As the Praetorian Guard began to press the advantage, General Gannes, the Roman commander leading the legions for Bassianus, made a bold and desperate move. Mounted on horseback, Gannes charged into the enemy lines, refusing to accept defeat. His sudden and forceful counterattack shattered the momentum of Macrinus's forces. The retreating soldiers, initially disheartened, now found new resolve as they rallied behind Gannes. With their morale restored, they turned the tables on the Praetorians and resumed their assault with renewed vigour. The fight had swung decisively in favour of the army of Bassianus. Fearing complete annihilation, Macrinus made the fateful decision to flee. He hastily retreated back to Antioch, seeking shelter behind its walls. But his defeat would not be limited to the battlefield. News of the defeat of Macrinus would spread like wildfire, and both his loyalists and supporters were ruthlessly hunted down. In an attempt to escape capture, Macrinus went to extreme lengths to disguise himself. Shaving off his beard and cutting his hair short, he transformed his appearance in a desperate bid to blend with the common man. On horseback, accompanied by a small group of companions, Macrinus would flee under the cover of night, making his way westward toward the distant safety of the Roman Empire's borders, eventually reaching what is now modern-day Turkey. But his flight was short-lived. Soon after crossing into unfamiliar territory, Macrinus was betrayed and captured. His son, who was appointed as his co-emperor in effort to solidify his rule, had been entrusted to the protection of King Artabanus of Parthia. However, fate was cruel. The young emperor, barely 10 years old, was intercepted by rebel soldiers and was tragically killed. The brief reign of Macrinus's 10-year-old son lasted under a month, a fleeting and tragic moment in the turbulent histories of Rome's imperial succession. Upon learning of his son's death, Macrinus's situation grew even more dire. Desperately, he attempted to escape his captors, but in the process, he injured himself, further sealing his fate. He was eventually put to death in central Anatolia, his life coming to a violent end. His severed head was then sent to Bassianus, who now had his final victory. In the aftermath of the death of Macrinus and his son, they were both declared enemies of the state by the Senate. The Senate's condemnation was swift and merciless. No stone would be left unturned in erasing the legacy of the fallen emperors. The portraits of Macrinus and his son were systematically destroyed, their names expunged from inscriptions, monuments, and papyri across the empire. In addition to the formal destruction of their images, the soldiers who had defected to Bassianus's cause went further, ransacking the estates and homes of Macrinus. All of their possessions, from personal items to imperial regalia, were seized and destroyed. The legacy of Macrinus, a man who had clawed his way to the throne from humble origins, was erased in a matter of months, his memory obliterated by those who had once placed their faith in him, only to see their allegiance shift to the young Bassianus. Thus, the story of Macrinus was one of obscurity and betrayal, his name destined to be forgotten in the ruthless tides of Roman imperial politics. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like, subscribe and share, and I'll see you all soon for another History Profile.